She's an artist, he's an admiral. Her paintings sell for millions, millions heed his command. On paper, there seems like a most unlikely partnership. In fact, their friends say, when you hear it, theirs is quite a romantic story. Here to tell you all about it are the couple themselves, Anjolie and Raja Menon. Welcome to the program. You know, let's go back to that first meeting. I gather it happened at Lovedale in school 51 years ago. At the time, Anjolie, I gather you hated Raja.
Yes, he was horrid. He was really a horrible little boy who used to throw wet paper pellets to the back of my neck. And I'd sort of turn around and see this chap grinning away. And obviously he was interested in me if he started throwing paper pellets at me when he was 12. But it didn't strike me at the time.
Why were you throwing paper pellets at her?
You know, 13-year-olds are that way. 13-year-old boys, 14-year-old, I suppose they're quite a horrid species. You're getting your first growth of hair and you don't know how to handle it. And before that, you hated girls. And now something seems to make you want to change your opinion. It's all a bit confusing age.
But tell me about Anjolie when you saw her. Was it in fact attraction as she's interpreted it, or were you just reacting the way you would to any girl?
No, I used to throw paper balls only at her, so there must have
So she was special.
No, we were rivals, you see. When I came to school, he'd already been there some time. And the first results of our tests were announced, and I had beaten him. And he got up and said, "That's impossible, I've always come first." And so the class master said, "No, I'm very sorry, Menon, you'll have to sit down because you didn't this time." So ever after that, there was this great rivalry academically.
Were you put out by the fact that she was more intelligent at that age?
I suppose so. I mean, I can't remember exactly. But, yeah, I suppose, you know, having topped the class for a number of years and suddenly to find a girl who's come in sideways in the 8th class, beaten you, must have been upsetting.
So wet paper pellets were the only way of handling.
Yeah, that's right.
Now, in fact, you say that your attitude to Raja changed the day he produced a chicken leg out of his uniform pocket.
No, isn't this a bizarre story? But I'll tell you that in a boarding school, one was perpetually hungry. So everything seems to be focused on food. And Raja was in the orchestra, and the Maharaja of Mysore at the time, who was then the governor, used to invite the orchestra to go and play at the palace, which is now Government House in Ooty. And our questions the next day in class would be, "What did you get to eat?" So they'd say, "We got chicken curry and we got this and that." We said, chicken curry, which was unknown for us in school at that time. So the next time he went, he very sort of reluctantly produced this soggy piece of chicken leg which he'd pulled out of the curry, wrapped in a paper napkin and put in his pocket.
And it won your favor.
And I said, "My God, he's brought me a piece of chicken." And all the girls said, "Hey, Menon brought her a piece of chicken."
So the way to Anjoli's heart was always through her stomach. In fact, in the 8th class, or was it the 10th class, the two of you actually struck a bargain with each other, didn't you? You made an arrangement which in a sense cemented this burgeoning relationship. What was it?
Well, I was absolutely hopeless at maths, partly because the maths teacher spoke in a South Indian accent which I didn't understand. She would say, "A into A equal A squared, B into B equal B squared." You don't understand anything. So Raja, who understood the accent, I said, "Can you just help me with my maths?" And he was hopeless at Hindi. I'm sorry to say, still is. But I did very well in maths in our final exams.
But sadly, Raja, you failed in Hindi.
So he must have been a better teacher than I was.
Do you think once again she got the better of the deal?
No, I must be stupid.
How
but that's very gallant if you're not blaming her for your failure.
I know. He's very gallant.
Yeah, but I mean, I still haven't passed my Hindi. I mean, I rose to a fairly high rank without having passed my basic Hindi.
But you found other excuses than Anjolie for it now.
Yeah.
But by the time you got to the 11th, it was a well-known secret in school, wasn't it, Raja, that the two of you were sweethearts. So when you continued to do badly in other subjects, your headmaster wrote to your mother to complain.
Yes.
What did he say?
He said Menon is seeing a girl and therefore doing badly, and Menon had better watch out. And of course I was confronted with maternal tantrums, where she said, you know, if you marry outside, I mean, if you marry anyone other than the one I choose, I'll commit suicide and all that. I mean, this is a very traumatic experience.
How old were you at the time?
16.
And were you quaking or were you secretly thrilled?
Yes, I was shivering in my shoes.
Now, in fact, Raja's mother didn't simply throw a tantrum, as he puts it. She wrote to your aunt Tara Ali Beg, who's quite a grand lady, didn't she?
Yes.
Were you alleged to be leading the poor darling astray?
Well, according to his mother, yes. But according to my aunt, this was a horrid family and I had to have nothing to do with them.
She was affronted.
She was very affronted and I think she wrote a very rude letter back to Raja's mother.
But your father took a much more indulgent view, didn't
Well, my father at that time sort of used, you know, we lost our mother. So Auntie Tara was sort of like in loco parentis, so to say. But my father was rather vague about these things. And it was only much later when things came to the boil, so to say. Because I went off to Paris after that, Raja went off to the NDA, and there's a big gap.
So he was quite happy to let his daughter carry on with this
No, he didn't.
schoolgirl crush because he knew not much was going to come of it.
Yeah, he thought nothing would come of it.
He was completely mistaken, wasn't he?
Absolutely. So
In fact, Anjali tells a lovely story. She says, although things seemingly ended when school was over and the two of you went your different ways, the truth is that when you got admitted to the National Defence Academy and passed through Delhi, you spent your time wandering through the streets of the capital looking for her in vain.
Yes, I mean, you know, I mean, I come from a very rural background, so cities were quite intimidating. I mean, I didn't know, for instance, how to use a telephone, and people would say, "Just ring me," and I would say, "Yes, of course." I used to approach this instrument quite fearfully, not knowing how to use it.
Were you really the village yokel you're making yourself out to be?
Absolutely.
So when you arrived in Delhi and you started this wandering through the streets of the capital, didn't you have her address?
Yes. No, actually, I think I spent a lot of time searching for her in Bombay. She used to come down to Bombay.
No, first you went up and down Willingdon Crescent.
Yes.
He just knew it was Willingdon Crescent, but he didn't know what number.
And he walked up and down hoping that you'd be there at one gate or the other.
Yes.
In midsummer it was.
So you sweated it out.
Well, we were very young and fit. We didn't mind the weather in those
But
days.
Anjali reciprocated, didn't she? You took time off to go to the NDA as often as you could.
Yes, General Habibullah was the commandant, great friends of my father's. And Nazli, his daughter, was my friend. So I'd tell my father I was just going up to see Nazli.
But in fact, you were going to see Raja.
And I'd quite often drag my cousin Zahid along as a decoy. And he'd grumble bitterly because he was made by General Habibullah to ride horses, which he didn't like.
But did you get to see Raja, or were
Yes, just briefly.
you a little peek at a time?
A little peek at a time. We once, I think, got to meet behind the cinema hall. And then Raja would get up at 5 o'clock in the morning, get out of his the squadron, which only opened at 6, out through a window, and meet me down by the lake with Nazli chaperoning us.
Now, the interesting thing is love clearly blossomed and burgeoned, but when it came to proposing marriage, you popped the question to Anjali's father rather than Anjali. Was that because as a young naval officer you thought that was the proper thing to do?
Yeah. I mean, the only model one had to go by were westerns, where the hero asks the father, you know, can I write letters to your daughter or something very formal like that. And we'd been going together for almost 6 years.
So you were modeling your life and your marriage on a Hollywood film.
Yeah, quite right, of course.
I mean, you were all prepared to go down on bended knee if it was required.
If it was required.
The worst thing was, Karan, he never did propose to me, because I think the closest he ever got was when we met just after the NDA, where he said, well, I don't suppose you, I can ask you to wait for me for so many years, because I'm only going to start earning in about 4 years' time. I mean, well, I don't suppose you want to wait for me. I mean, that was the closest he ever got.
But
to a
in fact, he
proposal.
didn't get an immediate yes from your father. This time round, your father wasn't as indulgent as earlier.
Not at all. He said he's much too young and he's got no manners.
No manners as well.
But my grandmother loved him.
That was your half-American grandmother?
Yes. She said, well, there's a lot to this young man. And I
Such
think,
as?
Well, she didn't specify, but she told my father, there's a lot to him. He's got a lot of character and personality.
You see?
He'll develop. So,
But your family never attended the wedding in the end, did they?
No, my mother had died and my father didn't come. He didn't disapprove, but he didn't come.
He wasn't going to give you his blessing, so to speak.
No.
Well, he was someone who always said that he didn't think it at all necessary to leave his village, even to come to Coimbatore, which was only 14 or 15 miles away. He never wanted to do that.
You know, it's an amazing story how the two of you got married, and then the marriage has gone on for an incredible 41 years.
Incredible.
You always describe Raja as masterful. What does that mean?
Well, you know, we belong to a generation, we women belong to a generation where you took these male chauvinists for granted. And we never knew at that stage, we were just sort of feminist generation, where all of us, in fact all my colleagues in college as well, we all took it for granted that we'd be married to these chauvinist men and that we had to pander to them. But we really got on with our own thing in parallel, so to say.
Are you a chauvinist, Raja?
Absolute.
No, hang on. I'm, if at all, I'm a benevolent chauvinist.
Which means?
Well, I think we were brought up in that generation, as she said, to believe that men had certain responsibilities and that they were better at certain things and you had better learn those things. And one expected that the woman would be better at certain other roles. I mean, the role defining was there.
Is this a polite way of saying that I am the master of my house and my wife knows it?
Oh, no. I mean, there was no question as to who was mistress in the house.
She wore the pants at home?
No, I mean, no.
But you were allowed to strut about in uniform?
Yeah, you see that cartoon where a whole lot of hens are remarking at this rooster walking by. There he goes to make the sun rise again. But...
yeah, I've done a lot of that.
But what I mean is, there was a lot of role defining, which I don't think is a bad thing.
Do you think more often than not she defined your role for you?
No. I think one had these roles defined by the things one saw and one grew up with.
Society at the time. But I'll say that the lucky thing is, that I think that's the only reason why we're still together after nearly 50 years, is that I actually, I mean, feminists hate me for this, but I actually prefer the things that women have to do. I felt I was very lucky being able to be at home, not having to do a 9 to 5, being able to spend time with the children, which I adored. I adore cooking.
In other words, you wouldn't have had Raja any other way.
Well, I liked him to do his own thing and actually to disappear from the house for a little while.
Let's take a break at that point. I want to come back in part 2 and talk to the two of you, not about the incredible story that lies behind your marriage, but about your own individual lives and the way you've been able to lead them while still being together. We'll be back in a moment's time. See you then. Welcome back. My guests are Anjolie and Raja Menon. Let's talk a little about your individual lives. Anjolie, you grew up in an army family. You have a half-American grandmother and a Brahmo Samaj environment as a child. Were you a product of many worlds?
Absolutely. Product of very many worlds. And I think at some point, especially after I got married to Raja, I felt that I'd been deprived of a very traditional Indian upbringing. But now, when we're a little older, I realize that all those influences actually helped us to live life in India at this moment with a little more understanding.
Quite in contrast to Anjolie, yours was a landowning Kerala family, part of the matrilineal system.
Yes.
Mummy, I take it, was the dominant influence at home.
Yes, in my case, I think she was very far-sighted. She, at that stage, realized that for any youngster to make good, he required a first-class education, and got me into the school which was open to Indians only at the time of independence.
She pushed you really to achieve the best you could.
Yes, she pushed. I mean, like a lot of Kerala parents, she pushed me a lot.
You had a wonderful little gadget at home which was quite unusual in the village, the only battery-run radio at that time.
Yes.
What sort of stuff would you listen to?
A lot of Carnatic music, the news every day, and for the first time we heard English as it's supposed to be spoken. And
Mean with the 1950s Indians speaking in clipped British accents?
Very clipped. And I still remember the man who was greatly admired, Melville de Mello.
With a big, deep voice.
Big, deep voice, yes. And we went to sleep listening to Carnatic music, hearing Melville de Mello, and there was a certain stability in the routine.
You started painting, Anjali, when you were 15, around about the time you lost your mother. In a sense, was painting your way of expressing your grief?
Yes, certainly it did help in a sort of catharsis. This wonderful teacher we had, Sushil Mukherjee, in school, did provide, I mean, the art room was the only haven of quiet and peace and a very gentle atmosphere. Because Lovedale was a military school, very military in those days, lots of marching, routine, structure, and a fair amount of bullying as well. So it was in the art school's art room that I would always seek solace.
You always talk about Sushil Mukherjee. Was he special in bringing out and encouraging your talent?
Absolutely. He made it very certain to my parents that I should be a painter and not be a doctor, as my father had hoped I might follow in his footsteps.
Would you go so far as to say that if any one person gets the credit for the artist that you've become, perhaps it's him?
Absolutely.
Without
doubt. Without doubt.
Raja, you did something that for a landowning family is quite surprising. You joined the Navy when you could have done almost anything you wanted. What took you to the services?
Well, actually, there was no one in the village to say what one should be doing. And the only college that I knew about was Madras Christian College in Madras, which was considered to be the best college.
And you didn't want to go there at all?
I didn't see one would go there and do what. And before I got into the NDA, I got into the railways. And I often wonder whether I should have joined the railways, but no, I mean, there wasn't anyone to tell me what does a railway officer do.
You're making it sound as if by default you ended up in the Navy. Yeah,
in a way, yes. But I didn't like the idea of waving flags to make trains go. I thought that's what railway people did.
So you chose to be a submariner instead?
Yeah, that's a little later, yes. Once I got into the NDA, then I came to know where the future was. And
the funny thing is that there are very few artists who end up as Navy wives. Was that a difficult position to find yourself in?
Well, one didn't sort of question it at the time. In fact, I was so relieved to finally find myself married to Raja. We had so many years of being apart, and then the struggle to convince our parents and all that, that I think we were rather, you know, usually women cry at their weddings, but I think
You whooped with joy.
I laughed through the whole thing because I was really very happy to
But what did the Navy
Raja
make of Anjali? Because it's quite a straight-jacket conventional profession, and here was this bohemian lady who painted, and she did it crouching rather than with an easel.
That's right. No, it's a fairly open society. And I mean, off the services, perhaps the Navy is more liberal in many ways.
Yes, and thank God it wasn't the Army. The Army was awful as far as wives are concerned.
So it would have been very difficult to be an artist and an Army wife?
Yes.
Probably. And we were always, and because of the Navy, we were always in large cities, and that helped a lot.
Now the interesting thing is your first big exhibition, your first solo exhibition happened just the year after you got married, and I gather that Raja played a seminal role, didn't he?
Well, he was so poor, you know, Raja, we married before Raja was actually allowed by the Navy. So he had to take special permission because he was only a sub-lieutenant. Sub-lieutenant earns 400 rupees in those days. So we were dead poor, and we were determined not to ask our parents for any money. So I wanted to have this exhibition. It's the only exhibition that I had with works on paper because I couldn't afford any canvas. And I had a few paints left over from my pre-marriage days, which I used. So the whole exhibition was works on paper, and Raja made the frames out of bamboo, strips of bamboo, and the whole framing for the entire exhibition cost 17 rupees.
17 rupees. And how many paintings did he frame?
I think there were about 25. So he just bought the bamboo and little nails, and he did the whole thing himself.
In fact, as Raja's wife, you've had exhibitions in amazing places. I mean, one I gather was in Vladivostok, where they gave you a broom cupboard to paint in to begin with, and then the oddest of exhibitions that followed. Do you remember it?
Absolutely. That was an amazing experience because they didn't allow me to do publicity of any sort. They wouldn't allow invitation cards because this is the first solo exhibition that they had in the Doma Khudojnikov, which was the House of Artists in Vladivostok. They never allowed solo shows because that was against the whole principle of Soviet policy.
They didn't seem to want you to exhibit nudes either.
And they took the 2 or 3 nudes out of the exhibition. They wouldn't allow me to exhibit them. But on the day of the opening, I found these queues, huge, a 1-mile long queue. And it was just by word of mouth that people had heard that a foreigner was going to have an exhibition. And the exhibition was packed. They didn't allow me to say that the works were on sale, but we thought of a very, I think Raja thought of that, a very clever device. On one of the paintings we wrote, "Not for sale." So everyone assumed that the others were.
I mustn't give the impression, Raja, that your whole life was spent simply promoting Anjali's
No,
art,
we never
because
have.
in
Or
fact,
making frames.
or making frames, because your friends say that you had one of the most distinguished careers in the Navy. Sadly, in '86, you had a heart attack, which, in a sense, cut it short. Was that a big blow not to end up as naval chief, as many said you could have?
Yeah, in a way, yes. But I mean, if you're on the fast track, you can rise to a 3-star rank. But whether you become the chief or not is a question.
It's a bit of luck.
Yeah, just luck. I mean, which bracket you be in. And after my heart attack, I began to seriously think on whether it would not be better to leave earlier and launch a second career.
You did, in fact, very successfully. You transformed into one of India's foremost strategic thinkers. Anjali always says that the second career is better suited to you. Do you agree?
I don't think I could have done the second career at an earlier age, because at an earlier age there was this whole business of driving a submarine, riding horses and ocean sailing and all that physical aspect, which I wouldn't have missed for anything. In later years, yes, I mean, once you've been through this, you can pretend to be the wise thinker.
Anjali, you've grown to be recognized as perhaps one of India's foremost painters. Today, looking back, what does fame and celebrity mean to you?
Well, nothing much. In fact, it's a bit of a nuisance.
I mean, it really gets in the way?
It does. I mean, I'm constantly phoned and contacted by the press or galleries or dealers. One becomes a sort of a commodity also.
But does the little girl who fell in love with Raja and Lovedale sometimes marvel at the way it's all ended up?
Yeah.
Hasn't ended, has it?
Hope not.
Raja says,
Yeah.
we still quarrel as much as we used to, except now we can't remember why we're quarreling.
Absolutely true. The worst thing about being married for 50 years is that you hardly have to speak to each other, because there's this immense telepathy. You know exactly what the other is thinking and what the other is up to as well.
Communicating in silence, is that your idea of a good marriage, Raja?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of communication does take place without speaking. And I certainly have believed that. I mean, one doesn't really need to use a lot of words to communicate.
Anjali and Raja,
Yeah.
a pleasure getting to know the two of you. Thank you for a wonderful interview.
Thank you.